Today we will be comparing two Sony wide-angle lenses, FE24mm F1.4 GM and FE28mm F2. As you probably know, these lenses are not exactly in the same category, so besides the comparison of the performance, we will also try to find out which of these lenses is the better choice for you, and of course whether the 24mm GM is really worth paying 3 times as much. The first difference between these two lenses is the field of view. 28mm is in my opinion a very suitable focal length for all-around shooting. It is good enough for everything from landscapes to environmental portraits. I think that it actually might be the most versatile focal length. On the other hand, it also means that 28mm may sometimes look a bit generic, because it is what most smartphones shoot, so we might need to work a bit more with the composition. 28mm give you significantly wider field of view. I would say that it is less versatile focal length, but also more interesting. It is the widest focal length that I would still consider for all-around use. It is my most favorite focal length for landscapes, cityscapes, and certain type of product shots. On APS-C you will get 36 and 40mm full-frame equivalents. These are very versatile all-round usable focal lengths, so if you own both full-frame and APS-C cameras, you are kind of getting two lenses for the price of one. The second difference is the aperture. F2 on 28mm is pretty wide aperture, but F1.4 on 24mm GM is just another level. In combination with that wide angle, it gives you a unique look that is not possible to achieve with anything else. You can get some of that look with 28mm F2, and it is still interesting, but not quite there. Both lenses are exceptionally small for what they can do. Mirrorless design definitely works here. 24mm GM is larger and heavier lens of course, but it is still very compact. The build quality is very good on both. The outer shell on 24mm GM is surprisingly made of plastics, but it still feels very solid and premium. 28mm is actually metal on the outside and it also feels solid and premium. The difference is that 24mm GM is fully weather sealed. 28mm F2 unfortunately isn't. You will also get more controls on 24mm GM. Here you have the focusing ring, aperture ring, autofocus manual focus switch, function button, and switch for turning the aperture clicks on and off. On 28mm F2 you only have the focusing ring. Both use focus by wire system of course, but the manual focusing is pretty good on both. I still prefer 24mm GM because it has more even resistance. Manual focusing is also linear on both. So how about the optical qualities? Here it is very obvious why the 24mm F1.4 GM costs as much as it does. It is extremely sharp. 28mm F2 can hold up when it comes to central sharpness on 24mm full-frame sensor. That is still better on 24mm GM, but the 28mm looks very good right from F2. When we look at the corners though, the difference is pretty huge. 24mm GM is very sharp right from F1.4. 28mm F2 is much softer at the corners. You actually need to stop the 28mm F2 to f8 to almost match the corner sharpness of 24mm F1.4 at f1.4. So that is one of the reasons why the GM costs 3 times as much. 24mm GM is very sharp across the frame right from f1.4. It is super sharp at f2.8 and extremely sharp at f4. 24MP sensor is actually the limit here. 24mm GM is made for new 61MP sensor, so 24MP is a piece of cake for the GM. The sharpness is still good on 28mm f2. It is of course more than usable. I would probably avoid using f2 unless necessary, but from f4 the image quality is very good overall. It is very similar on APS-C. The central sharpness is still very good on 28, but as we move towards the corners, the images get softer. The sharpest point is still around f5.6 to f8. 24mm GM is sharp enough for APS-C pixel density, and surprisingly it is still very sharp at f1.4 across the frame and super sharp at f2.8. The contrast on 24mm GM impressed me even more than the sharpness. The colors just look beautiful with this lens, they are very punchy and the micro contrast is excellent. Similar to the sharpness, 28mm f2 is not bad, it has decent contrast, but it definitely can't match 24mm GM. Another very impressive thing about 24mm is the rendition of bokeh. It uses 11 aperture blades, and I have to say that the autofocus background looks great. The transition between the subject in focus and out of focus is very smooth. At f1.4 you can get a lot of background separation even at 24mm. You can use that in a creative way to get a very unique look, which also increases the versatility of this lens. 28mm f2 uses 7 blades and the bokeh is not quite as smooth, but still pretty nice. Again, there is a significant difference, and because 24mm GM has one stop faster aperture, it can also blur the background more. There is significantly less distortion on 24mm GM, where the amount is very acceptable. It can be fixed by profile corrections in camera or in editing, and it doesn't affect the image quality at all. 28mm f2 has a lot more bubble distortion, but it is not terrible. It can still be fixed of course, but it probably affects the corner sharpness a bit. The amount of chromatic aberration on 24mm GM is also remarkably low for wide angle and f1.4 lens. There is some at f1.4, but the amount is very acceptable and easy to fix in Lightroom or Luminar. It is almost completely gone at f2, which is great. The chromatic aberration on 28mm f2 is actually very low. There is almost none and it can be completely removed, so no complaints here. Minimum focusing distance on 24mm GM is just 24 cm. That means that you can get very close to the subject and capture interesting perspective. In combination with f1.4 aperture, you can also get a lot of background or foreground separation when you get closer to the subject. On 28mm f2 it is 29 cm, so we can get similar magnification with both lenses. The autofocus is excellent on both. 24mm GM uses new direct drive supersonic wave motor autofocus system, and as expected the autofocus is flawless in combination with A7 III. It is basically the same on 28mm f2. The autofocus is fast and accurate, so no complaints here either. Autofocus motors are also completely silent on both lenses. That also makes this combination very suitable for gimbal use. The manual focusing is a bit better on 24mm GM. Both lenses use focus by wire system, which is linear on both with reasonable amount of resistance and turning angle, but the ring is a bit smoother on 24mm GM. The manual focusing is generally fine on both, considering that it is focus by wire system. Common disadvantage of both lenses is the focus breathing. It is clearly visible that the object in frame are changing the size as you are focusing. 24mm is generally not a focal length where you would do much focus pulling, and it won't be visible unless you are close to minimal focus distance, so I don't mind that so much on this lens, but keep it in mind. On 28mm f2 it is similar, but it is smaller and cheaper lens, so I would say that the focus breathing is more forgivable on 28mm. 24mm GM has an option to use clickless aperture, so you can make smooth exposure changes in video, which is a very nice option. Sony cameras have clear image zoom function, which crops the image in video up to 2 times with full 4K resolution. That is useful with wide-angle primes. On A7 III the image quality significantly decreases when you use this function, but it is still a nice option to have. Neither of these lenses is stabilized, but fortunately the in-body image stabilization in A7 III is very effective at these focal lengths. It is more than sufficient for static shots or handheld panning. It will smooth out the walking a bit, but for that you probably want to use a gimbal. I have tested 24mm f1.4 with Zhiyun Weebill S, and that is my most favorite gimbal, camera and lens combination at the moment. I have tested 28mm f2 with Feutech AK2000 and I was also happy with the results, so both lenses are generally suitable for gimbal use. So is Sony FE 24mm f1.4 G Master worth triple the price of Sony FE 28mm f2? Well, that is always a matter of preference and your budget. There is definitely a big difference in optical qualities. 24mm f1.4 just takes nicer images in every way. It is sharper, the contrast is excellent, out of focus background looks great, the colors are beautiful, it is as good as it gets. If you expected the 28mm f2 to be like 5% worse, and you wanted to hear that you can save the money and have almost the same images, that is not the case. I still think the 28mm f2 is a great lens. I keep it as a walk-around lens because it is much smaller, the image quality is still good enough, and 28mm is a bit more versatile focal length. It is also a great value and I generally recommend it. 24mm f1.4 is close to being perfect. Focus breathing is basically the only disadvantage that it has, so if it is within your budget, I do recommend it, you won't be disappointed. If not, 28mm f2 is a good choice as well. So that's it for this video, thank you for watching, I hope that you liked this video and that you found it to be useful. Stay tuned for more videos and maybe consider subscribing if you don't want to miss my future content. I appreciate your feedback in form of thumbs up or thumbs down. If you would like to ask anything or share your opinion, please do so in the comment section and see you next time.